Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, May 6, 2020. One step forward for small d democracy in the Empire State. It was just about a week ago that we reported with some disdain that Governor Cuomo's handpicked two-man election commission, which was empowered by some murky language in a recent budget bill to rejigger the primary that has been delayed until June in New York, to exclude candidates who had, quote-unquote, dropped out of the presidential primary. They weren't going to cancel the entire election. No, it's going to be primarily conducted by mail. But they said because of the risk to voters who only were going to turn out to vote mostly in the Democratic presidential primary, there's no contest on the Republican side, that they were going to save them the trouble. Now, of course, many of these same voters, by mail or at the precinct, were going to participate in state-level elections, congressional primaries. I don't know if New York has ballot measures on this particular election, but I am pleased to report that Andrew Yang brought a federal lawsuit. And yesterday, the judge ruled that the state had wrongfully removed Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang, and 8 other former presidential candidates from the ballot. That even though they have, quote-unquote, suspended their campaigns, that New York voters have a right to exercise their choice, and because it affects the allocation of delegates to the Democratic National Convention, if there is one. So the order reinstated the Prez primary, and the judge called the action to cancel it authoritarian and illegal. And I just thought it was wrong. U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres wrote the state had deprived voters of their constitutional guarantee of freedom of association. New York voters, she said, weren't just voting for a presidential candidate, but, as I said, for delegates to the convention. Quote, the removal of presidential contenders from the primary ballot not only deprived those candidates of the chance to garner votes for the Democratic Party's nomination, it deprived Democratic voters of the opportunity to elect delegates who could push their point of view in that forum. And I don't see a quote here addressing the facetiousness of claiming that this was because of the pandemic and in order to protect public health, as I have already argued. So in today's New York Times, and I don't want to call her elderly, but she is a veteran observer of politics, Elizabeth Drew, as a woman can raise a question that I have been reluctant to, frankly, because I didn't want to get smacked back and accused of being sexist. But in mid-March, when there was still a race for the presidential nomination on the Democratic side, Joe Biden made a commitment, a pledge, to choose a woman as his vice presidential nominee. And to me, it smacked of desperation, pandering, and fundamentally it offends my sense related to identity politics. Now, I understand that some of these glass ceiling issues are very important to certain people, especially women. And African Americans reveled that Barack Obama was the first elected black man. But I believe it can tie your hands and limit the ability to field a team of candidates, a pair in this case, that can not only win, but could govern effectively. So Drew makes some interesting arguments here. She says that many presidential scholars think that the only clear-cut case of a VP selection helping the nominee win was way back in 1960, when JFK put LBJ on his team and then proceeded to isolate him until, of course, he was assassinated in Dallas. Was there collusion on LBJ's part? Well, it's such a convoluted conspiracy, it's difficult to say for sure. And so I have made the argument, not that I prefer Amy Klobuchar, but when you make a pure, cold political science calculation about who could help a weakened candidate like Joe Biden carry the day in November, well, Klobuchar made the case all through the primary debates that she won handily in most of the counties in Minnesota in the year that Trump won Minnesota. And so I have argued, again, she's not my top candidate. I think she's capable. I've met her. I think she's bright. She's qualified. She never threw anything at me or demanded to borrow my comb to eat her yogurt with. But if you look at the LBJ-JFK pairing, you might think of Dick Durbin. But like Biden, he is a longtime Washington insider. Illinois is not a state that is likely to go to Trump's side. And so Drew makes the argument that chemistry is important. She reminds us that Jimmy Carter chose Walter Mondale. Carter was the outsider. He'd only been governor of Georgia. And Mondale was the guy who knew all the machinery in the U.S. Senate. And they got along well until Carter delivered the malaise speech. And Drew writes their governing partnership never recovered from that. I don't know why that was such a big deal. I thought it was an odd speech at the time, but I don't think that it was self-defeating or somehow wounded the Carter-Mondale administration. Then Drew talks about how Obama picked Joe Biden. Because Obama was the young guy, was seen as inexperienced, and he was the first black man running. And she writes that Biden was strong on where Obama was weak, legislative maneuverings of Congress, and I don't agree with her on foreign policy, but he was seen as having experience. I often think that experience with bad judgment doesn't count. And she writes, during the nomination struggle this year, Obama sought to ascertain his own comfort level with Biden by calling him 2 or 3 times a week, ostensibly to discuss issues. And she writes, though few outsiders knew it and a couple of others were in the running, Biden was Obama's first choice all along. Well, that's not lost on me. I thought it was obvious all along. And especially after Nevada, when the so-called hidden hand of Barry Obama suddenly got all the other moderate candidates to drop out. Then there was the fix in South Carolina with Clyburn's endorsement, the media overkill, and some rumors that they pumped up the vote count even though Biden had already won handily. So she says, look, whatever happens in November, has the future of the party been kidnapped by this decision? Did Biden's pledge to select a woman as running mate set a precedent that a woman always has to be on the ticket? What if in some future election, Hispanics demand it's their turn, or African Americans? Where does such identity politics end? Well, on that, I concur with Elizabeth Drew. Now, here's a piece I want to argue with. It's on the opinion pages of the New York Times today, under the byline of Linda Hirschman, the author of Reckoning, the Epic Battle Against Sexual Abuse and Harassment. And the kind of moral relativism, the deals with the devil that she advocates here, really offend me. Opening paragraph here, let's be clear, she says, I believe Tara Reid. I believed Anita Hill, too. Remember the buttons? I wore one. What's the constant here? Joe Biden, then the bumbling head of the Senate Judiciary Committee during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, now the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee. And her headline reads, I believe Tara Reid. I'm voting for Joe Biden anyway. And so she kind of meanders through her own history, how she was blisteringly angry at Gloria Steinem, who threw Monica Lewinsky under the bus to protect Bill Clinton. And Linda Hirschman had the high ground then. And she said, I maintain my position supporting Lewinsky until 2 decades and a Me Too movement later. Ms. Steinem issued a non-apology for the essay, and so she says, triple hate. I hate to say the following. Suck it up and make the utilitarian bargain. Now, I believe that this bargain involves magical thinking. She says, all major Democratic Party figures have indicated that they're not budging on the presumptive nominee, and the transaction costs of replacing him would be suicidal. Barring some miracle, it's going to be Biden. Well, 2 things. Hillary Clinton, 2016, and the superdelegates who wouldn't budge, knowing the self-inflicted wounds of her emails and the scandal that it provoked, the Wall Street speeches that Bernie so successfully skewered her with, and her really bad record on foreign policy. And the other thing I'd argue with here, Ms. Hirschman, is that Joe Biden can withdraw. He doesn't have to be, dismissed by backroom politics at the Democratic National Committee. He can just recognize the handwriting on the wall, and he could step aside. It's a little messy, and it would involve machinations that may inflame some voters, including supporters of Bernie Sanders. I would argue that Sanders is in the second place position, and he should be elevated if Biden steps aside. But they're so allergic to him that they'll reach for a Cuomo or somebody who I can't summon at the moment as a stand-in for Biden, who would have a better chance of beating Trump. It would certainly upend the Trump strategy. So Hirschman calls it utilitarianism and claims that it is not a moral abdication, it is a moral stance. And on that, I call bullshit and fantasy. Because if you think that your moral compromise can heave Joe Biden over the line in November, you're kidding yourself. His weaknesses from Ukraine to Tara Reade and the baggage that would fill an entire baggage car on Amtrak will follow him and be exploited. And you can pretend that those things can be wished away. But the right-wing attack machine is all oiled up and ready to slay him. And then she invokes the concept of a shipwreck. And she credits David Hume, suggested that nobody can be expected to behave justly when trying to survive a shipwreck. And she closes by saying, it may not be just, but I'm swimming away from Mr. Trump's sinking ship as hard as I can. If I have to, I'll vote for Mr. Biden. I hope I'm not going to drown anyway. Wow. That's what the Democratic Party has devolved to. And it's one of the reasons I'm not a Democrat. Now, this doesn't come directly from former President Obama, but his office, responding to a request for presidential documents that Obama could veto access to from Senate committees run by Republicans who are continuing to investigate Trump's scenario that it was Ukraine that meddled in the 2016 election, not Russia. Now, as you know, I find both of those angles pretty far-fetched. I don't think Russia, meddled in any significant degree that changed the outcome. And as I just argued over the past few days, it was Israel that openly and covertly meddled, as we now know, in the 2016 election. And I'm planning to record an in-depth interview with Allison Weir and maybe one other participant tomorrow regarding the new disclosures about Israeli contacts with Roger Stone and the clear efforts they were engaged in to meddle in the American election. So, the office of Obama first blasted a congressional investigation into Biden and his son, as well as alleged Ukrainian election interference, calling it an effort to give credence to a Russian disinformation campaign. And that was the testimony of Fiona Hill during the inquiry that led to the impeachment process at the end of last year. So this records request was initiated by Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson. Grassley at the Finance Committee, Johnson at Homeland Security Committee, asking for records on meeting between the Obama administration and Ukrainian officials going back to 15 and 16. So first the blast, and then Obama ultimately agreed that the records could be released in the interest of countering the misinformation campaign underlying this request. That means they've looked and they feel confident that there's nothing there. So, as I said, under federal law, both the current and former president have the option to claim executive privilege over records of this sort, and certainly Trump is not going to object, and Obama has relented. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos of the Amway fortune of Michigan, now playing education secretary in this Trump reality show, she has released a sweeping new directive governing how colleges and universities must handle allegations of sexual assault and harassment. I have mixed feelings about this because it does give new rights to the accused and gives a clearer idea of how such a process should run. They ban the appointment of a single judicial-like figure to preside over these investigations. I'm not against that. And while I want to always stand for the rights of the accused, this confers cross-examination rights that could seriously prevent women from reporting sexual assault. And honestly, I don't know exactly how to balance that, because a false accusation, or in the case of Brock Turner, the now notorious former Stanford student, a swimmer, a star, who molested but did not rape, and that's a definitional issue. He, like Joe Biden is accused of, Brock Turner was accused of digitally penetrating his victim. And he appeared to be ready to go further, but their hookup, and she was very drunk, behind a dumpster, was interrupted by some passers-by. And so in that case, I believe that the judge, who eventually was recalled by angry feminists at Stanford, is the one who paid the real price. And it's fair to say that the sentence he imposed was fairly light. But if we use that as a model, in this case, the victim remained anonymous. She did participate in the legal process and finally revealed her identity after the trial. And so I just want to be candid that I do believe there are times when male accused cannot properly defend themselves. But I don't trust Betsy DeVos as some paragon of liberty and justice. I don't think her motives here are pure. And so I think there will be a well-deserved controversy about these proposed rules. They're trying to get them in place in a brief period of time here to prevent the law that allows the next administration to review and cancel last-minute rules that were imposed by the preceding administration. So yesterday I opened the podcast with some kind of not fully formed ideas. And I led with the idea that the Trump administration, led by Mike Pompeo, in their effort to put the blame solidly and squarely on China for the pandemic, and to, in some cases, it's argued that they would demand money damages. And I asked, is this just a domestic political posture to exploit in order to blame China, whether there's evidence for it or not? Or is this part of a larger effort, what Pepe Escobar calls the hybrid war on China, to ultimately try to dislodge the communist government? So I was pleased to see in today's LA Times a column by Washington columnist Doyle McManus. And he echoes some of the questions I was asking, and he calls it a potentially dangerous new Cold War. Trump and other administration officials claim the virus, which many scientists say originally came from a bat, emerged from a Chinese government lab in Wuhan. They've offered no evidence, and both General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Dr. Fauci say that they have seen none. But Pompeo's gone further. He says the episode, including Beijing's alleged efforts to conceal the initial outbreak, shows that China's communist government is inherently malign. And McManus quotes Pompeo, "This is an enormous crisis created by the fact that the Chinese Communist Party reverted to the kinds of disinformation, the kinds of concealment that authoritarian regimes do." Now, I will argue, because McManus doesn't, that we engage in disinformation, concealment, and we claim we're not authoritarian, or not yet. And then Pompeo says that Trump is trying to correct 40 years of appeasement of China, which McManus correctly notes would take us back to the Carter administration. Then he is gentler on Matthew Pottinger, the number 2 guy on the National Security Council who made this speech in Mandarin in a conference held online connected to the University of Virginia. This was on Monday. And he didn't reference the same quotes that I did, but McManus then goes into the requisite criticism of China, and this is accurate. China's government is autocratic and corrupt. President Xi has been steering the country away from democracy and reform. His military has bullied weaker neighbors, especially in the South China Sea. In this crisis, China has sounded more like an adversary than a competitor, making what he calls unsubstantiated claims, and they are unsubstantiated, that a visiting U.S. soldier may have brought the coronavirus to Wuhan. Now, I haven't ruled that out. It is unsubstantiated, and so are the arguments that it came from the Wuhan Virology Institute. And we hear from China comments about the security breach at Fort Detrick, America's bioweapons lab, last summer. They all deserve to be examined. Back to McManus. He quotes a newscaster on Beijing's government-owned television network. "If the dishonest behavior of evil politicians like Pompeo continues, Make America Great Again could become merely a joke." So what McManus also brings up, which echoes my comments yesterday, more serious is the question of how far this new Cold War will go, and whether it's happening only because Trump needs a campaign issue more promising than the plummeting economy. So I've linked to his piece, and if you'd care to examine it, follow the link at peterbcollins.com on the show page for this podcast. Well, if you're like me, your heart skipped a beat yesterday because the news broke in fragments. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, aged 87, a cancer survivor, was in the hospital, we were told. Ruh-roh. Then we learned that it was just a procedure, a non-surgical treatment for a gallbladder and the removal of a gallstone. She did it at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in the afternoon after participating in oral arguments on the Booking.com trademark case. And this morning, RBG was back on the phone. and I haven't been able to review the detailed reports of the oral arguments today, but it related to the Obamacare coverage of contraception and the efforts by the Trump administration, because it is so religious, to carve out religious exemptions that are based on the fatuous notion that corporations can be religious, and therefore a corporation can deny employees contraceptive coverage as required by Obamacare. And Obama went to great lengths because the little sisters of the poor, at the behest of the, how can I put it? I'm referring to the Catholic bishops. And they have preferred to pursue an end to contraception and an end to abortion at the expense of moral choices, supporting the Trump administration. You know, the treatment of immigrants, the demonizing of brown people, and many other moral, how can I put it, failings of this administration. So this case was up at the court before when there were only 8 members, and they punted, kicked it back to the lower court, which punted it back up to them. And I'll cover this in more detail tomorrow when I have a chance to review the proceedings of the court today. And speaking of the bench, one of the main reasons Mitch McConnell called the Senate back into session was to try to confirm a 37-year-old white conservative protege of his. Now, they managed to get him on a district court. He was only sworn in on Easter. And already, court-packing Mitch wants to move him up to the critical D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And that, of course, is the grooming spot for future Supreme Court justices. Now, for the district court confirmation process, the American Bar Association said that Justin Walker was quite unqualified. And Senator Feinstein of California said, after serving briefly as a district court judge, he's now been nominated to the D.C. Circuit. In his short time on the bench, Judge Walker has had virtually none of the experience one would expect of a district court judge before elevation to the circuit. He also was a surrogate in support of the nomination and confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. He's openly hostile to the Affordable Care Act, which is before the Supreme Court today. And what is really bizarre is that the American Bar Association, that rated him deeply unqualified, I may have added the deeply, to be a trial court judge, has changed their rating. And so, different qualifications for the appeals court, for gosh sakes. And they have said, let's see, he got a surprise boost late Tuesday when the ABA reversed its initial not qualified rating and instead has called him well qualified for this more prominent post. ABA said its switch came from the differences between the courts, with the appellate court post placing less emphasis on trial experience and instead a high degree of legal scholarship, academic talent, analytical and writing abilities. They forgot to mention frequent appearances on Fox News. And one of the few things he's ruled on was an appeal of the Democratic governor of Kentucky's ban on religious services on Easter Sunday. And let me correct, he was celebrating his confirmation on Easter weekend. Mitch McConnell flew back to Kentucky. He actually has been serving for a few months longer than that. But at any rate, the most high-profile decision he made was in favor of religious services being held during a pandemic. And that gives us an indication that he's on the God Squad and that he is dangerous in how he would rule on appeals coming up before the D.C. Circuit. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my podcast and currently support the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, helping out listeners and people they know who could use $100 at a difficult time like this. And I want to thank Faith Peoples. She's a very loyal, generous supporter of this podcast. At one point, I think she had 4 or 5 different subscriptions. And she topped it off with an extra $50 that she sent via PayPal. Thank you very much, Faith. I appreciate your support for me and for people in need at this moment. Today, I don't have any requests for a $100 grant. So if you're in that position where you haven't gotten your unemployment, let me tell you, I'm pretty lucky. The podcast is not the only endeavor that I operate. I have a business. I'm self-employed. And a week ago, they opened up unemployment filings for people like me. And on Saturday, I put my application in online, and in the wee hours this morning, I got confirmation that I've qualified for benefits, and my first check for $167, it's actually a debit card, is on the way. And they tell us that the $600 federal boost will come whenever it hits the California accounts. They're not being very clear about that. So I'm fortunate that my application for federal benefits at this time has been approved, and a trickle of money is coming in. So it redoubles my intent to help those who didn't get the $1,200, those who, for whatever reasons, don't qualify for unemployment in the state or area where you live. And so we have funds available. Don't be shy about tapping this offer. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com, and I am prepared to issue you a payment of $100 to help you get through this difficult time. And if you'd like to add to the kitty, all you have to do is PayPal, as usual, Peter at peterbcollins.com, or you can mail a check for any amount to my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. So get this. We're in a pandemic. It's a form of influenza. And yet what we see as a response from the Trump administration is what I would call affluenza. Because Trump is signaling that Nancy Pelosi's request for up to $1 trillion more in bailouts for state and local government, and they badly need it, and I believe they should get it, is going to be linked to further tax cuts for the wealthy. The list of ideas on their wish list includes a reduction in the capital gains tax, measures of depreciation that would allow companies to deduct the full cost of any investment that they make now or in the future. And the language I've heard discussed is that it would be applied to back taxes or to future taxes at the whim of the company, whatever gets them the best break. Trump is still pushing for a suspension of payroll taxes. And that, of course, would lead to a reduction in funding for Social Security and Medicare. But the real topper here is that he wants to reinstate a full deduction for the 2-martini lunch. Or is it 3? He tweeted today he wants lawsuit indemnification for companies related to coronavirus and business deductions for restaurants and entertainment. Just another way to line his own pockets at the Trump hotels and resorts that he has not distanced himself from. This is really ugly, and the Republicans will push hard to get that self-dealing passed into law. Here's today's COVID-19 report prepared by Linda Lewis. The worldwide death count attributed to the coronavirus is now at 258,000. The U.S. death number, 71,220. And you may have heard by now that Rick Bright, who was pushed aside, as the director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority inside the Health and Human Services Department, has now filed a whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel, alleging the Trump administration failed to prepare for the onslaught of the coronavirus, then sought a quick fix by trying to rush the unproven drug hydroxychloroquine to patients, including buying large amounts of these pills from Pakistan and India that had not been inspected by the FDA. And he was reassigned to a desk job, apparently with no phone, because when he reported to duty, I think at the CDC, they did not actually have an assignment for him. Also, while Trump has promoted reopening, claiming that we've solved every problem, HHS and FEMA officials are warning of a higher death toll and report continuing equipment shortages. The concerns were expressed in audio recordings obtained by Politico of 3 conference call meetings that included Trump, held on April 24th and May 1st, with FEMA and HHS teams. CDC Director of the Influenza Division, Daniel Jernigan, quoted from the recording as saying the numbers of deaths definitely will be high. Nearly all of FEMA's regional teams reported continued increase in cases and deaths as governors move to terminate stay-at-home orders, flagging hotspots in prisons, meat processing plants, and facilities for senior citizens. Another official is quoted, "If at the end of stay-at-home orders you were to lift everything and go back to normal business and not have any community mitigation, you would expect to see in the second week in May that we begin to increase again in ventilator uses, which means cases increase, and we, by early June, would surpass the number of ventilators we currently have." Now, Trump is giving conflicting signals. Yesterday, he said that the coronavirus task force, with all those people who stand behind him at his press briefings, it would shut down and be replaced by a new advisory board, likely more pliable to his political aims. And we can hope that Trump will not go back to these daily 2-hour so-called, I call them performances, he called them briefings. So he did acknowledge yesterday that it's possible more Americans will die as stay-at-home orders are lifted, but we have to get our country open, he said. And this is the trade-off that is in many cases inevitable. But in my view, he appears to be moving too quickly to try to get the economy back on some track in time for his hoped-for re-election. He's also blocking appearances by Dr. Fauci, but only at the House of Representatives committees, because he said the House is a bunch of Trump haters. And even Republican Tom Cole of Oklahoma said that he's on one of the committees that has asked Fauci to appear. He said, "I think it would have been good testimony, useful to this committee, useful to this country." So, of course, he can't confront his president or he'll be tweeted into oblivion. By now, you've probably already seen this photo of Trump. He flew to Phoenix yesterday to inspect a factory run by Honeywell that's been converted to the production of surgical masks. And, of course, he wouldn't put one on, not when he was on camera. So he paraded around in a silly set of see-through glasses. You know, the kind that people in laboratories or people running weed whackers will put on. And somebody who had control of the PA system in this factory that he was touring while the photo op rolled put on the Guns N' Roses version of Live and Let Die and blared it out at very high decibels, so that if you saw the footage with sound, you couldn't hear a thing that Trump was saying. Whoever did that, nicely done. And Axl Rose this time has not popped up to object to his music being played in the presence of Trump. Now, one of the things I criticize California Governor Gavin Newsom for is the secrecy he continues to maintain over a deal that he trumpeted a few weeks back, that he was committing over $900 to the purchase of a shipload, I didn't say shitload, of surgical masks. And he was going to get so many of them that he was willing to share them with other states. Well, California advanced about $450 million to a company that turned out as called Blue Flame Medical, created by two well-connected Republican operatives who have been in business since March. Now, this is profiteering, pure and simple. They also had a smaller deal with the state of Maryland, which has the biggest spike of cases in the D.C. region. And so even as recently as Monday, as the California legislature has been holding some hearings, the Newsom administration refuses to provide details. Now, they did get the $457 million deposit back, and Maryland got $12.5 million back. But the Justice Department is investigating, but given that these two guys are Republicans, they'll probably get off easier than those bozos, I think they were from Tennessee, who were trying to sell hand sanitizer at highly inflated processes also back in March. And it kind of reminds us of those guys from Montana who formed a company and then went to Puerto Rico after the hurricanes and said, oh, yeah, we'll rewire your grid. Just give us the money. So this back and forth about whether we're going to have the same task force or a different task force, it basically shows that Trump is trying to find ways to insulate himself from difficult decisions or a resurgence of the virus. He's trying to silence even Dr. Birx, plus, of course, Dr. Fauci, who make comments that contradict him and that he finds to be inconvenient. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Trump also visited at the White House today with the governor of Iowa. And her name is Reynolds. Sorry, I don't have her first name here. And she's a Republican. And she has announced that they are lifting the lockdown in Iowa that was never imposed. No, they relied on people's good intentions, and it led to the huge outbreaks of the virus, particularly in rural-based meatpacking plants in the state. And, of course, they won't talk about the people who work at the slaughterhouses because they're disposable, and Trump has ordered that those facilities must remain open because they're so central to the economy and to the food supply, even at the cost of the people who work there. I want to thank our friend from Switzerland, Olivier de Merlot, and it's spelled Mirleau. It's not that red wine. And Olivier sent me an email that walks through a discussion, a debate, over whether the lockdowns were called for and whether they actually produced the desired effect. And he takes us through a set of arguments. Number one, that whether the virus was worse than regular viruses and whether lockdowns help in any way. And on point A, he says that the virus could be worse because a higher percentage of those infected die, or the virus is more contagious. And he does acknowledge that we need control groups to analyze the data and to develop meaningful results. And he also acknowledges that hindsight gives us a lot more data than we had when we entered this process that did create fear. And he argues that the fear was stoked, and I think that's fair. The media coverage, particularly here in the United States, has been quite hysterical. And by excluding coverage of many other news stories, it creates the perception, particularly among people locked down in front of their flat screens, that, golly, this is terrible, terrible, and we should be hysterical. So he says, I don't pretend to have solved the riddle, and I lean to the skeptic side. If I were forced to bet, I would bet that the lockdown was not warranted. And Olivier, I think a year from now, we'll be able to make a better analysis. I do think that it's too early to tell. I don't dismiss your arguments, but I think because of the contagious nature and the way it came blasting into the United States from both coasts, the cruise ships on the West Coast and the high infection rate and death count in New York City, that we do need to fully study the data to understand whether the, as Trump likes to reduce it to, the cure was worse than the disease. Over at the Washington Post fact-check desk, they took a look at a new Trump ad called American Comeback. And this is so selectively edited and tricked up. They go through it in great detail. CNN has even written a cease and desist letter to the Trump re-election campaign because the remarks of two of its on-air people have been edited to give a false impression. And based on the analysis from the Post here, I would have to agree. I have not seen the commercial, but some video is taken out of context, other content is deceptively edited, and in some cases it is just deliberately altered. And so I will link to this so you can review it, but it does show that in the era of deep fake videos, where you can manipulate the moving lips of an individual to make it seem like they're saying something they never said, well, the amount of editing and the amount that was left on the proverbial cutting room floor makes Wolf Blitzer and Sanjay Gupta and Nancy Pelosi and others who are included in this very fast-paced 1-minute commercial appear to be saying things that are favorable to Trump. And when you include the qualifying remarks that they really said, it shows that this has been edited to deceive people. It's a James O'Keefe dream, in my opinion. Now, Trump has gone back and forth on whether his vanity border wall should just be these steel bollards that are cemented into the ground at 6-inch intervals. Already we've seen people with rechargeable buzz saws be able to cut through them. But he wants to now up the cost by another $500 million or even more by his decision to paint them black. Now, he argues that if they're black, they'll be so hot that people won't want to touch them. Well, Don, that works during the daylight hours in the summertime, but, people operate at night, too. And, he's trying to sell this as an upgrade to prevent the trans-border carrying of a virus like COVID-19. And that argument may sell to some people, but I don't know any of them. I want to thank Tom McAfee, who forwarded me a link to a commentary from Michael Moore. Now, this is broadly aimed at the critics of Planet of the Humans, but he doesn't single out Bill McKibben, who singled him out, even though Moore wasn't directly featured in the film. He produced it, and he has promoted it and endorsed it. And so Moore writes, many of the people and organizations who are working hard to save us aren't. It's not that they haven't tried, they have, and we're proud of them and ourselves and all the work that we've done in the environmental movement. We're grateful to our environmental leaders, brilliant research, writings, protests, successes. Except it hasn't worked. The climate battle has been lost, or it's being lost. And he says, look, I was there at the first Earth Day, and I made one of my early videos at the time. But he notes correctly, 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone. We ate them. 60% of the mammals are gone, and 95% of the mammals that are left are either humans, our pets, or our dinner. Somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 species are going extinct every year. We have lost half of all our topsoil. Some predict it'll be gone in 60 years. It takes 1,000 years to regenerate just 3 centimeters of new topsoil. Of the Earth's 37 main aquifer systems, 21 of them are at near collapse. We lost 1.2 billion acres of rainforest in just 1 year, 2018. We were not supposed to go above 350 parts per million of the carbon we spew into the atmosphere. We're now at 415, which means we are beyond the point of no return. We will have no chance of even coming close to halting the coming collapse if we cannot first admit we have failed. We can no longer solar panel and windmill our way out of this disaster. I'm so sorry I have to say this, but friends, we are no longer on the right road. And if we don't change course immediately, if we're too proud to ask for directions, new directions, to start a bold new discussion of what must be done, and do so without green hedge fund managers at the table, then we might as well keep driving this electric Buick off the cliff. And he doesn't criticize any individual or group. He says often they were well-intentioned or occasionally misguided or just simply wrong. He said, I saw unions hop into bed with management. I covered Democrats who were really Republicans. In my last film, I called out Barack Obama for going to Flint and pretending to drink Flint water and telling people their tainted water was safe when it wasn't. Now, 50 years after the first Earth Day, I have to stand here and tell you, with my support of Jeff Gibbs' film, that we must ask difficult questions of the people we love on our side of the political divide. Is green capitalism really our savior? Are we being manipulated with fear and forced anxiety so that we'll buy more? To what ends? When the pandemic is over, do you want to go back to the old way of being wage slaves, no real power over your own lives, accepting that the democracy is probably over? Planet of the Humans, he says, has no personal bone to pick with anyone. We've all messed up. We've all been on the wrong road. What's our way out? Besides planting 1 billion trees, yes, he says, ending capitalism greed, the 1% nationalizing the energy companies, bring back teaching civics in our schools, and the list goes on. Well, I acknowledge weaknesses in the film. Some of it is dated. The attack on McKibben for still supporting biomass is flat out wrong. But I think that more is sounding the alarm in a way that people need to listen to. Stop being defensive. Stop trying to protect your favorite environmental leader. And let's try to make changes before it truly is too late. I want to recommend a very good investigative piece by Aaron Mate at the Gray Zone Project, following up on their continuing publication of whistleblower claims from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The latest installment includes documents that flatly contradict the leadership of this agency related to the alleged chemical release in April 2018 in the Syrian city of Douma that led to missile launches by the United States, and claims that really were contradicted by the fact-finding mission that went to Douma. And as they tried to sanitize the report of the people on the ground to support the conclusion that had already been prepared, that this was at the feet of the Syrian military and Bashar al-Assad, they have documents that show that Ian Henderson was, in fact, one of the leaders of the fact-finding mission, and his boss has said, no, that's not true. So I commend the Gray Zone for continuing on that important story. There's more coming out about the so-called Keystone Cops Bay of Pigs, the latest attempt to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And Alan McLeod, once again at Mid-Press News, has some of the best reporting, linking the U.S. mercenaries who led this attempt to impose regime change in Caracas over the past week or so, culminating in the deaths of some of the mercenaries and the arrest of some of the Americans who were leading this group that they claim was up to 300 people. And one of the things they reveal is that this guy, John Goudreau, who runs the Florida-based mercenary shop Silver Corps, He did some work for the Trump campaign, providing security at some of the mob rallies. And this is unfolding like another Tiger King-style episode, produced by Trailer Trash Films. And so Juan Guaido stiffed him. He signed a contract but didn't deliver the millions of dollars, including $1.5 million retainer fee. But Goudreau continued with his scheme. And now he's flatly saying that his American mercenary leaders, who used to be part of special forces, should be rescued from Venezuela by the Trump administration. There's also a pretty amusing account at BuzzFeed under the byline of J. Lester Feeder. I linked to that, and you can check it out. And there's also a curious report from the Washington Post. Now, to their credit, they got the first break on this story and published some of Goudreau's comments as early as this past Sunday night when the would-be invasion was collapsing. And two of his key dudes were running out of gas in their speedboat and had to to go to one of the Caribbean islands to refuel. But read this. This is such poison yellow journalism in the Post. Referring to Maduro, for years the embattled demagogue has warned of foreign plots against his rule, waving at the specter of treacherous coups and imperialist invasions. It's true. Such alarmism often served as a smokescreen for his government's failures and the economic collapse that has taken place under his watch. But this time, as footage circulated by Venezuelan authorities on social media appeared to show, a number of apprehended insurrectionists, including 2 former U.S. Special Ops soldiers, Maduro may have a point. Now, they ignore the attempt to overthrow Chavez back in 2004 during the Bush administration, which didn't last long. Chavez was returned to power some 48 hours later. But the framing of this suggests that while these are cartoonish actions by idiots, that the main goal of overthrowing Maduro is justified. And, of course, it's supported by both parties in this country. And that is not teased out in the report either. And finally today, we have an op-ed published at the New York Times disclosing Facebook's latest overseers of censorship. Now, they don't call it that. They have created a panel of experts with 4 co-chairs and 16 other members. They come from different professional, cultural, and religious backgrounds, have various political viewpoints. They have a fund that is in trust provided by Facebook that is going to pay for their operations and probably some fat salaries. A $130 million trust fund, completely independent of Facebook. Board members will serve fixed terms of 3 years, up to a maximum of 3 terms. They contract directly with the oversight board, cannot be removed by Facebook. Now, they're going to create a review system that is accessible to people. Well, that is an improvement because right now, if you're put in Facebook jail, you get no explanation other than, oh, you violated community standards or some bullshit like that. There's no appeal. You can't call anybody. They don't respond to your emails. So these people are promising that while they can't respond to every case, they will be responding to some of them, the ones that they think are substantial and, important to more than one person. So these 4 members are a former special rapporteur on freedom of expression for the Organization of the American States, Catalina Botero Marino, Jamal Green, a law professor at Columbia, Michael McConnell, a law professor at Stanford, and Helle Thorning-Schmidt, former Prime Minister of Denmark. Sounds like a cushy gig for all these people. We'll see how it plays out. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You'll find it on YouTube. You can share it with anyone. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.